The last speaker in this stories section is Patricia Boechler, and her talk will be on the third dimension, immersive virtual environments in educational practice and research. She is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and associate dean for research in the Faculty of Education. She's also the director of the Technology and Learning Sciences Lab in the Faculty of Education. Her academic training is in developmental psychology and cognitive science. For the past 16 years, her research and teaching has focused on the underlying psychology of learning from and with technology, most recently learning and teaching within virtual environments. She will be giving an overview of the prevalence of virtual world use, and then we'll review some of the research examples and educational examples of projects using virtual worlds. So, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and to be part of this event, and also to get a chance to see some of the fascinating work that my colleagues are doing. Emerging technologies in many different fields is, I guess, fascinating. It's one of those words that shows up continuously, but I'm amazed at the ways that it can be implemented in very different ways. Today, I would like to describe for you collection of works that my colleagues and my graduate students have implemented regarding virtual worlds use in education. Of course, what we do in our educational systems, whether it's K-12 or post-secondary education, can have very profound effects on not just our students while they're here, but also in society in general. And some of the changes that we see in technologies right in this moment can have dramatic impact on what comes ahead for us in just a few short years, actually. So what I would say is we're not talking within the decade, we're not talking within 20 years, we're talking about maybe next year or 3 years or that sort of timeline. So to begin my talk, I would like to share some information with you about virtual worlds, and some of this might be surprising to you. In 2014, industry reports on virtual world use indicate that 313 million 10 to 13-year-olds are registered users of a virtual world called Poptropica. 110 million 13 to 15-year-olds are registered users of Minecraft. 140 million 15 to 20-year-olds are registered users of Maplestory. 120 million 20 to 25-year-olds are registered users of IMVU or MVU. And 41 million 30-plus-year-olds are registered users of Second Life. That means that right now, not 10 years from now, not 15 years from now, right now, 683 million young people worldwide between the ages of 10 to 25 years old are registered in the most popular virtual worlds. This is not all the virtual worlds. These are just the most popular virtual worlds in the age categories that I outlined. So my question for you is, are we as post-secondary educators ready for the next wave of learners and the next wave of 3D technologies? Virtual 3D immersive environments aren't new. In the 1970s, we started to have text-based versions of these interactive interfaces. By the 1980s, we started to have these graphical user interfaces where you could be represented as avatar. And this one is one of the earliest ones, Habitat, and it is represented in a 2D environment, so it's a little bit different than what we're talking about today. But this was sort of the beginning of things. There's a point that I'd like to make about the difference between video games and virtual worlds. Video games are enacted within virtual worlds, but not all virtual environments are video games. So the first 3 points I have for you on the screen here are elements that are shared by these two types of technologies. They have a shared and persistent 3D environment. It exists whether you're there or not, and it's there when you log in. Individuals are represented as avatars within that environment. So when you walk into these spaces, any other avatar that you see is someone else. Interactions both with the environment and other avatars occur in real time. So there's no asynchronous interaction going on in these kinds of environments. It's happening in the moment, and the interaction is between two people or more people in that particular moment. The development of video games and virtual environments follow a shared trajectory, but users of virtual environments can build and alter and manipulate their environment in ways that video game users cannot. Virtual environments are not rule or goal-based. They're open-ended spaces where people can use them in ways that they can dream up or be creative about, or for certain purposes that maybe they as a collective group decide that they would like to enact in those environments. So in that way, they are very different from video games. However, the current state of video games can serve as a very good predictor of what we might see in virtual worlds in a very short time. If you look at this very popular video game called Tomb Raider with Lara Croft, I think you've probably all seen versions of this, and you look at and that's not the very beginning actually, I've got 1997, if you can see it at the top of the column there. The game began in 1996, but that tells you, gives you some sense of how the graphics have changed. The bottom one is 2003. At present, the virtual worlds that we have available to us as educators that we can manipulate and build and create our educational spaces probably have the graphics comparable to that bottom cell there. So about 2003, this is the year that Second Life came out, and some other very similar open source versions of the same software. So this is sort of what we're looking at within these environments at this moment. If we jump ahead a little bit, we can see all the way up to 2008, and the graphics associated with this video game have changed quite dramatically. So if we look at right up to current 2014, that's less than 20 years from the outset of Tomb Raider, this is what we now have for the sophistication of graphics. This is not quite available to us in the kind of worlds that I'm talking about, where we can create the type of environment that we choose to, and this is what makes these environments particularly valuable for education. But this is what's coming. So if you ever hear comments about, well, some of these virtual worlds, the graphics are not so great, and it's because they're designed to allow us to manipulate the environment. So that's a bit of a more sophisticated process than containing something in a video game that has parameters around what can happen within that environment. So something's got to give. But this is probably where we're heading not too long a time as far as the sophistication of graphics within these programs. And I think looking at this, everyone would agree that that potentially could be pretty engaging for our post-secondary students. So how does this translate into educational settings? In other words, what do we need to know to make sure that if we use these environments, we are doing so in a way that is promoting learning, promoting engagement in education? How do we know how to do this? Well, we know these two things. So I'll let you have a look there. We know that these environments do have characteristics that are highly valuable to educational endeavors. We also know that we don't really, at this moment, have a very coherent theory, learning theory or psychological theory about how we can optimize these environments for learning. So that is someplace that we need to begin. And that is basically the description of my program of research. I look at elements of psychology that are relevant to this particular technology. And I'm going to run through a few examples for you here of some of the research projects that we've done and some of the actual classroom implementations that we've done. One of the things I was curious about right from the outset is what captures people's attentions in these environments. This is a study we did on incidental learning. And incidental learning is the type of learning that occurs without you intending to study or notice or do anything that you might be aware of. So I wanted to see what captures people's attention to a degree that they would actually remember it. So in this study, we had people walk through an environment as avatar. We had them do a small little distractor task, but we gave them absolutely no instruction about what to do with these information boards. When we tested them later, we found out that even a very small manipulation, in this case it was just bolded text on that billboard, was enough to capture their attention and have them remember that information. I was also curious about what does the environment surrounding that learner, what kind of layout of that environment might impact learning. So we did a second study where we used the same format of walking through the environment and being exposed to information, and in this instance, text-based and image-based information. And we had a learning phase where we did instruct the students to go through, pay attention to the information, and try and remember it as well as they could. When we tested them later on that, we moved the landmarks around. I don't know if you can see it well in this slide, I apologize. But we made a very minuscule change in some of the landmarks, the picnic table, et cetera. And again, this impacted how well students could remember information. So we know that even what looks like benign changes can have a big impact on how people remember information. We're in the process of looking at how do social interactions impact learning in these environments, and also looking at the idea of individual differences. What do students take into these environments that impact their ability to learn? In this case, we were looking at extroverts versus introverts and their tendency to be distracted by social interaction. It was just text-based interaction. And unfortunately, we haven't had time to analyze this particular data, but these are the kinds of studies that we're doing. Along with those very sort of experimental and controlled studies, we've been injecting virtual worlds into classroom practice. So this is an example of a class that is an interprofessional health science class. The students do a mock patient interview, and there's students that are in dentistry, medicine, nursing, et cetera, and they're trying to learn how to communicate interprofessionally while they conduct a patient interview. The advantage of using virtual worlds here is we can create any patient we like. So they can have the experience of interviewing a patient that in real life, that patient may have a condition that they would very rarely see. We've also used this in education classes. So in this case, we had an assignment where education students had to create some sort of virtual world assignment that they would give to students. In this one, we had 3 students that developed this dentist's office. And again, replicating a rare event. And this one was an allergic reaction that a patient would have in a dentist chair. That doesn't happen very often. So the scenario here that the students built was that that event happens and the participant has to go around and problem solve. What do I do? And in one of their scenarios, they did get an EpiPen, but they found it was damaged and they had to rethink the whole approach of how they should deal with this patient. A little bit more low stress than the actual situation, but they may not come across this in their entire career as a dentist. So very rare event. We're looking at doing this in an introducing music class. It's very difficult to enact really close listening activities in very large theaters like this. And so we've implemented this within these virtual environments. What it allows us to do as well is connect the music that the students are listening to all sorts of cultural and socio-political influences that might have been happening at the time that the composer lived. And this becomes a very immersive experience for them. They can click on and listen to the music in a replica of the concert hall that composer would have had their music played in. And finally, we did student orientation. We attacked a very practical problem, but quite an important problem, because students often arrive to a big institution like this with a lot of anxiety. And we looked at giving tours to students that came from areas surrounding Edmonton that had never been on campus here. They came in for an hour. We walked them through 5 important tasks that they need to do when they arrive here, gave them the experience of being on campus, and gave them instructions about how to enact these tasks. I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. Again, 683 million young people using and have experience with and are engaged by virtual environments. We have a saying in education, tapping into the meaningful. And what that means is capturing students attention through the things that they find meaningful in their lives. We know that a lot of students spend hours and hours in these kinds of environments. They express their feelings and their ideas about their work, their social lives, and their recreational passions. This is where they live a reasonable amount of the hours of their lives. And so I would say to you, and leave you with one last question is, and probably the largest question about using virtual worlds in education is, will we rise to the challenge of finding ways to meet them there? Thank you.